Good afternoon and welcome to today's Atlantic Council Front Page event. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Atlantic Council Front Page is our premier platform for global leaders. To fulfill that mission, we are delighted to welcome United States Congressman and Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Honorable Mike Turner of Ohio, to discuss the geopolitical situation that will face the next U.S. president. This event, held in partnership with RBC Capital Markets, is the final event of the Atlantic Council's bipartisan election year series titled Elections 2024, America's Role in the World. In the lead up to next week's presidential and congressional elections, this series has worked to promote high-level, substantive conversations on the impact that this election will have on U.S. foreign policy. As we always say at the Atlantic Council, we're out to provide light and not.
This is just frozen. Sure. Fred, thank you so much. I understand that we're going to pause for a minute with your comments. Greatly appreciate you having me, and I want to thank you so much for the Atlantic Council and all of the work that you do to contribute to the dialogue of what's important, both for international security and for the transatlantic relationship. The individuals that you bring together help formulate policy for the future. You're absolutely right that we have so much to talk about with respect to what's going to be handed to the next administration. And really, I think it comes apart. It comes in part from what we've seen in a sort of a failure of leadership from this administration. So many times, as people have talked about the policies that have come out of this administration, the Biden administration, it's been so how they've sort of the Biden administration has sort of been sleepwalking through a number of policy international crises where the president has really kicked things to the cabinet, where the cabinet has almost dissolved into acting like they're NATO, where they come together and try to conclude issues by almost coming to a consensus. If they can't come to a consensus, then there's no direction that is resolved and no action is taken. They try to manage the issues as opposed to really resolve or conclude them. That means that the next administration has a number of issues that are going to be handed to them that are unresolved. Ukraine certainly being one. The administration has been more interested in the restrictions that they've been placing on Ukraine, not to be provocative, not to, as they have said, to escalate the conflict rather than to resolve the conflict. Similarly, as we just saw with the conflict of direct attacks from Iran on Israel, they've been more concerned rather than ending the conflict of, as they've said, making certain that it doesn't escalate, although Iran attacking Israel directly is an escalation. You see it also with the Houthis, where the administration says they don't want escalation, although the Houthis have been attacking directly with commercial traffic, right there, and have made it very difficult for the United States without going in and really taking military action to address that. And of course, the administration even ignoring Russians' efforts to put a nuclear weapon into space as an anti-satellite weapon, which would be incredibly provocative and violations of the nuclear weapons treaty, and the administration seemingly acting as if that would be tolerable, not even discussing what the United States position would be. And then with Russia inviting North Korean troops into Russia, perhaps even taking them to the battle in Ukraine, the administration not even acting as if this is a red line of North Korean troops entering into battle in Europe. All of these things are going to have to take real leadership from the administration that's coming in next, and that's going to have to be the shift. Is that our adversaries and our allies are going to have to be faced with an administration, regardless of who it is, that's going to have to take a step of leadership. Our allies are going to have to be rallied, and our adversaries are going to be faced with an administration that's going to have to step up the plate to change the direction of these conflicts, as our allies need rallied, and our adversaries, which are beginning to coordinate with one another, are going to have to see a United States that is going to step up and say, we're going to not only de-escalate, but resolve these conflicts in favor of the United States and our allies. With that, Fred, hopefully you've rejoined us.
Thank you, Chairman Turner. I guess we had some video problems, but I'm glad to be back, and I think I heard a lot of what you had to say. Forgive me if some of my questions may go a little deeper on something what you've already said. I'm not sure if people already had the directions, but before I turn to you for my questions, we're on the record, and you can submit your questions along with your name and affiliation to askac.org. And please give your name and affiliation. And thank you for joining us. And I'll turn to your questions throughout the event. Something happened that doesn't happen very often a few days ago, where you had the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, and the head of the UK Secret Service, Richard Moore, talking about how we're at the most dangerous point for the international order that we created together with our friends and allies at the end of World War II, that's brought the world so much peace and prosperity. So from your perspective, Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and you see things that are both classified and unclassified, can you provide a high-level view of how you prioritize the threats facing the United States? You know, war in Europe, war in the Middle East, tensions around Asia, a competition for the commanding heights of technology. It's a lot, and the context is going to be the same irrespective of whether President Trump is elected or whether Vice President Harris is elected. So give us a feeling of how you would brief this context to the next president of the United States as the chair of your committee.
Right. Well, you know, China obviously is the most significant threat, but the most immediate threat really is the one that's emerging with this sort of axis of evil, as it's been called, of North Korea and Iran and Russia, that is beginning to coordinate in a way that is very, very threatening, both to the United States and to our allies. And unfortunately, in what we're going to have to accomplish in the next administration is we have not been coordinating with our allies. As you see, Israel responding to Iran and Iran's direct attacks against Israel, you don't see Israel targeting within Iran the production facilities in Iran that are actually supplying Russia, for example, that are ending up on the battlefields of Ukraine. But you do see Iran, Russia, North Korea coordinating. You see now even reports of Russia and the Houthis, which of course are an Iranian satellite, coordinating. You see all of these adversaries of ours and to the West coordinating and working in a way that is very destabilizing, and in a way where, of course, they're authoritarian regimes that are joining together. Now, if you layer on top of that China, you have to understand that, you know, when President Xi went and stood next to Vladimir Putin as the Ukraine war began to unfold, and in what we consider to be a hot mic, an open mic moment, President Xi was caught standing next to Putin, and he said, "We, you know, the two of them, are bringing about change that hasn't happened within 100 years." Well, we know what that 100 years is. That 100 years is World War I and World War II. That's the fight between authoritarianism and democracy. And that's what all of these axis of evil have in common, is they're authoritarian regimes. They're fighting against our allies' democracies. And they're doing so for grabs of territory and to destabilize democracies around them, using proxies or direct attacks. And that is a direct threat, and a direct threat to the United States. And that's what the United States is going to be facing into the next administration, is understanding that that is a direct threat to the United States, a direct threat to the West. These are not small territorial skirmishes. They are not regional conflicts. This is a much broader conflict. And we have Vladimir Putin and President Xi standing together, acknowledging so.
Thank you for that context. George Will, writing recently in the Washington Post, compared this election to 1940, where Germany was at war, Japan was at war, we were not yet at war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, however, did become a wartime president. Do you think there's a danger that the 47th president of the United States either already is a wartime president in some respects or could become so when you look at this axis of aggressors? I mean, if I go back to the 1930s, if you look at Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese, they weren't really cooperating as closely in defense industrial terms right now as I think China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are.
Well, you just made a very, very good and important point there, and that is the industrial base. And that is one of the things that we're going to have to turn to, regardless of leadership, regardless of how we assert or use our leadership. If you take, we have to go back all the way to the George Bush era, where we had actually a focus on our industrial base and working with our allies on the ways in which we produced and that we looked at modernization of our capabilities. And then as we rolled into the Obama era, and you'll recall the era of sequestration, where the defense budget was cannibalized, if you will, and there were significant cuts overall in defense spending. And during that Obama era, that cannibalization, those cuts occurred to our modernization efforts. And there was a promise, if you will, that those modernization efforts would be made in the future, that they would be brought forward. Well, they were not. They didn't happen in the Trump era. They did not happen in the Biden era. And so, but as our adversaries looked forward, they did. China has been modernizing its nuclear weapons and tripling its overall nuclear weapons capabilities, its navy, certainly its its anti-satellite weapon systems. Russia has been advancing, not only modernizing, but advancing its nuclear weapon systems, its satellite systems, its technology systems. Certainly North Korea and Iran have similarly been modernizing and expanding tremendously their industrial weapons base, which we're seeing show up on the battlefields of Ukraine. Tomorrow, if we were in a conflict, the ability for us to turn on our systems, to be able to produce the weapon systems just to defend ourselves, is very difficult, as the West is seeing in just the effort to supply the conflict in Ukraine is very difficult. So regardless of policy, regardless of scope of conflict, the next administration is going to have to turn to the now well over beyond a decade of deferred maintenance and modernization that needs to happen to the United States military systems, so that we can have parity with our great power competitors, so that we don't have a major conflict with Russia and China. And then turn to, as you indicated, the industrial base that is not up to being a deterrence to produce what we need to be able to respond.
Thank you for that. Let me drill down on that a little bit, talking about an op-ed published last month by you in the New York Times, talking about the People's Republic of China as the most pressing threat, which you've also said in this conversation, but the most pressing threat when it comes to a nuclear strike on the United States or its allies. The congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission found that the U.S. nuclear modernization program of record was necessary but not sufficient to address simultaneous nuclear challenges from China, Russia, and North Korea, all of which are there, potentially over time, Iran perhaps as well. Can you explain the audience specifically what your thoughts are on the nuclear forces? And do you foresee that the United States needs to expand its nuclear arsenal? You seem to suggest that in the last answer, and especially after the New START arms control agreement with Russia expires in early 2026.
Sure. I use this analogy frequently. So I've got a 1964 Cadillac, and I park it in the garage, and it's an antique, and I love to drive it around. It's great to enjoy. And I could say I have a car, but in fact I have an antique. And if you think of that as a nuclear weapon, if you buy a nuclear weapon and you park it in a silo, you're going to have to go buy another nuclear weapon, or you don't have something that's a reliable deterrent. You're not going to take a 1964 car and make it your reliable car to use for your commute. And that's what we've done. We've bought nuclear weapons and we put them in a silo and we said, check, we have one. Well, our adversaries have continued to build new and more modern nuclear weapons while we've kept our old ones in a silo and said, check, we we have one. Well, we don't. We have to build new ones just like we would go and buy a new automobile. The problem is that in addition to then our adversaries building new ones, every time they go and build a new one, as you know, when you get in my 1964 car, you don't have that display, you don't have all the features that a new car does. Their nuclear weapons have more modern features and they're more reliable. When you turn that key, it's going to, do things that the other ones don't. And that's what Russia's doing, and that's what China's doing. And so when they look back at what the United States is doing, they don't look at us as having the same level of deterrence that they do. And we are the only nuclear power that isn't capable of rolling off of the production line that new nuclear weapon that can go down in that silo while they're still doing the same. And it's not that anybody's saying, hey, great, we need more nuclear weapons. It's just that if you're going to be a nuclear power, if you're going to have deterrence, if you're going to be able to say to China and Russia, we are the beacon of democracy and you're, the stalwart of authoritarianism, or we're going to stand there and be the deterrence, that we have to invest and we have to make certain that you're not going to have better than we have. Right now, Russia is continuing to advance its nuclear weapons, ones that go into space that include hypersonics, orbit the Earth and then come down to their targets, some that are unmanned, subs that go underwater and then come up against cities. China has hypersonic nuclear weapons. We do not even have hypersonic weapons, not hypersonic nuclear weapons, but not even hypersonic weapons, all of which that they're developing. And again, the issue is, how do we deter them? How do we make certain that when they go to their military offices, that they look at the United States as a viable deterrent to their regimes and their desire to advance?
Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, now ambassador here, talks about this as the Xi Jinping shaving mirror test, that when he wakes up in the morning, he just has to say, no, not today. We're not going to take a risk, whether it's with Taiwan or whether it's nuclear. Because you mentioned the Russia space plans, I'd like to touch on something that you said earlier that became a little bit controversial. You pressured the Biden administration into revealing Russia's plans for a nuclear-armed on-orbit anti-satellite weapon, and you called the threat Cuban Missile Crisis in space. And should he win, he could, should he win, how could a Trump presidency ensure the world is free to continue to operate in space? So how do you address this? And should the United States harden some or all of its satellites in low Earth orbit against the effects of nuclear detonation? I talk to people in the intelligence world, and they tell me that what keeps them up at night is the issue of space.
Right. And this is really one of the failure of leaderships of this administration, is that they got intelligence that indicated that Russia was developing an anti-satellite nuclear weapon, and then they sat on it. Imagine if John F. Kennedy had sat on the information that Russia was planning on putting nuclear weapons in Cuba, and did nothing, and waited till Russia put nuclear weapons in Cuba. I would go as far to say is that Europe might not be free today, because the United States would be more reticent to challenge Russia, knowing that nuclear weapons were so close to the United States. But in this instance, this is about checkmate. This is about Russia putting nuclear weapons in space and being able to say to the United States, checkmate. So the Department of Defense, in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, indicated that if the Russian anti-satellite nuclear weapon is put into space and then detonated, that a low Earth orbit, all satellites in low Earth orbit would be decimated, and that low Earth orbit would be not habitable by satellites for up to a year. It could be longer. That means that all of our reliance on space, whether it be economical, our financial institutions, our communications systems, our military, all would be wiped out. What's also extraordinary about this is that the commander for Space Force has said, actually, if that satellite is put into space, from the moment that it's there, it's day zero. Because that very next day that satellite is in space, we have to assume the next day that we don't have access to space. So we'll immediately have to spend trillions of dollars we don't have and implement technology that we don't have to be able to find alternatives for use of space, because you can't just harden satellites that are already up there. You can't go get them. And we don't have technology that can sufficiently harden satellites and put them up there that can sustain the kinetic impact or even the radiation of currently of a nuclear explosion in space. So it would be irresponsible for us to continue to be space dependent that day that it is up there. So he says day zero, the very next day, we will have to configure ourselves differently. So this is a complete failure by this administration. They're continuing to do nothing. This should have been something where they're galvanizing the entire world. This impacts China. This impacts everyone. The moment that Russia does this and checkmates the entire world by putting a nuclear satellite against, by the way, the current treaty regime of which they're signatories.
So thank you for that answer. Colleague of mine, friend of mine, David Ignatius, has just put out a new novel called Phantom Orbit, which is very much touches on issues of this sort. And it sounds futuristic when you read it, but when I listen to your answer, it sounds like it's real time. So speaking of things that one needs to respond to, but what is the response? We now know that at least 3,000, probably as many as 10,000 North Korean soldiers are training on Russian soil. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the new one, said that they were some of them in the Kursk region, some of them are special operations, so some of their best soldiers. You argued that direct military action should be on the table if those troops are used against Ukraine. Can you make clear to me what you mean by direct military action, and how can U.S. policymakers, how can a newly elected president make clear to Russia that this kind of military support constitutes a clear escalation and then deter? Right now, we don't seem to be deterring these sorts of decisions by their leadership.
Right. Well, this administration has been absolutely silent. I mean, they've said nothing. It's almost as if they're just reporters. They're reporting what is happening as opposed to making policy statements about what should happen or what even the United States position is. We don't know what the United States position is because they have not articulated one. The position should be that this is a red line for the United States. And similarly, they should be calling on NATO to declare it a red line. Now, what are some of the consequences of that red line? Well, the United States, wrongly, I believe, but the United States currently has a policy that Ukraine is unable to use weapons given to it by NATO countries and by the United States to attack valid military targets inside Russia. So, for example, if Russia uses a military system to attack Ukraine from Russian territory into Ukraine, Ukraine cannot attack that system back with U.S. weapons or NATO systems. Now, that's a valid military target. They should be able to answer. Currently, the administration considers that provocative. Actually, the first attack from Russia should be the provocation. You should be able to defend yourself. But this administration says, no, it would be provocative for Ukraine to defend itself against that attack. So they don't allow them to do so. Clearly, I think the administration, though, should say that if that attack comes from North Koreans on Ukrainian soil, that they should not be able to enjoy the same restriction that the Biden administration has placed on Ukraine. It should not be open season on Ukraine from Russian territory. Russia should not be able to willy-nilly invite any nation across the world to come in and set up shop in Russia and hit targets in Ukraine and not be subject to a response from Ukraine. That's one. Now, secondly, I think the United States and NATO allies should seriously discuss and consider that attacking directly North Korean troops that are in Ukraine and that are attacking Ukraine. North Korean troops do not belong in Europe attacking another European nation, and I think it is in NATO's interest and certainly the United States' interests as a member of NATO that Asian North Korean communist troops should not be marching in to a European country and attacking it. They should not have the current restriction that is placed on the protection of not attacking between NATO and the United States and Russian troops. That is a valid discussion that I think that should be had. I'm not saying that it should be a decision that is finalized, that they should say, yes, we're shooting, but I think they should have the discussion that North Korean troops should not be free from not being valid military targets from both NATO and the United States.
That's a fascinating answer on that. So questions are coming in, and a lot of them do revolve around Ukraine. So let me go to a couple of them. And I think a lot of this goes to a feeling that, you know, from Republican officials, legislators, and others, you hear some that would argue that that President Biden should have done much more. I think you're arguing that with the ability to hit within Russia, and then you hear from others, including President Trump, the notion that one could bring this to a very quick end, this Ukraine fight to a great end, or a quick end. Jack Kroponsky is really asking, whether President Biden's "for long as it takes" is resonating with American voters, or are people worried about an endless or forever war? And then what you would think is the answer to that?
Well, the problem with it, as long as it takes, is it leaves Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian soldiers forever on a front line of a war of attrition. Because if you're not hitting into Russia, their industrial base of military production, they're just going to keep producing weapons and bullets that they're going to take to the front line, or they're going to shoot from Russia into Ukraine. And that's only going to result in increased and continuing casualties into Ukraine. You're going to have some point at which there is a diminishing return for Russia. And the only way really for Ukraine to be able to protect itself is to be willing to allow them to hit the industrial infrastructure that is producing the military capabilities that is causing the casualties and the attacks in Ukraine. This is not sustainable in the manner in which it is. It is incredibly cruel, and it's certainly not in a sustainable, winnable way that it needs to be, when we're looking at that this is a battle between authoritarianism and democracy. This is something where we need to give Ukraine the support that it needs, that it is winnable, so that democracy doesn't have to continue to just see this front line continue to move in a diminishing way.
And so this is to the second part of his question, which is what prevents us from forcing a more timely and expeditious solution to the crisis in Ukraine? I would answer that. I think you've answered that. Is it by giving Ukraine more military capability, pushing them more quickly to the negotiating table, or some mixture of both?
Right. I think it has to be in giving them the means within which to defend themselves and win. They are a very capable fighting force, and they want to fight and they want to win. Giving them that opportunity, I think, will result in their achieving that. And that, I mean, giving them the ability to fight for their freedom and to be able to sustain freedom is incredibly important, I think, for all of us.
Thank you for that. And then a last question in this area, and this is from Colby Badwar from the Insider. Would you encourage the next president, regardless of who it is, to both lift restrictions on Ukraine — I think you said that — and provide its forces with joint air-to-surface standoff cruise missiles?
Well, I think all the capabilities need to be reviewed. I mean, I don't think that there's like one magic bullet. I do think that as we look to all the systems that they've requested and how they can be supplied, and both in targets and in what Russia is doing, that there are real ways to coordinate. And I think our allies need to be leaned on much more closely, so that their systems and their capabilities are supplied. I think there can be an increased focus on capabilities for Ukraine that can be sort of an awakening for Russia, that they can see that they have things at risk. And right now, I don't think they see. I mean, these are acceptable losses to Vladimir Putin. He needs to be in a position where he believes that he has something at risk, and that currently is not the situation.
Lots of interest in this subject. I guess not surprising, Mr. Chairman, but the Daniel Breslau asks, if Republicans control one or both chambers of the House and the White House, do you expect the appetite? What do you expect the appetite will be for further supplemental appropriations for Ukraine? Will support for Ukraine look different than it does now?
Well, most of the significant concern about continued support for Ukraine has been support for Ukraine under this administration's constraints to Ukraine. People want a plan to win. They want a plan and support that will result in a change of direction that where people can believe that this is going to result in Russia being pushed out and Ukraine being sustained. A change administration is going to change this concern. I mean, the most thing that has dominated all aspects of this administration's policies, and you saw it even in Biden's statements as soon as Israel had responded to Iran's last attack, was, well, at least we haven't been provocative. He wants everything to stay the same. Well, they're not staying the same. Our adversaries are not acting the same. They are becoming more provocative. They are advancing. If we stay the same, we are going to be staying the same in losing. And that's certainly what we don't want to see with Ukraine. If there is a viable support and strong support, I think you'll see stronger support in Congress.
Thank you for that. Another very interesting question from a longtime friend of mine, Leonard Schrank. He's the chairman of the American European Community Association, and he was the former CEO of SWIFT, living in Brussels. What recommendations would you offer the next president on addressing the threat from Iran? And I guess I'd broaden that out of how do you think Middle East approach should stay in general? I know you've talked about that some. With what's happened over the last weeks, the killing of the Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, the death of Sinwar, the head of the Hamas leader. You just had a strike of Israel on Iran. One could argue that this is, or one even has some belief that the Israelis might see this as a historic opportunity to finally turn around really decades of Iranian disruption through proxies in the Middle East. So Leonard Schrank's question about how you would approach that, but maybe also in the context of what do you think our general approach to the region ought to be?
No, that's a really good point, Fred. On the issue of proxies first, this is an unbelievable opportunity for Lebanon and Hamas to take a critical view of what could they do to free themselves of Hezbollah and Hamas. As Israel is taking action against them both, and that they're being diminished. Lebanon really was in a situation where they did not have the freedom to take other choices with respect to Hezbollah. They're going to find themselves at that point, and hopefully they will be able to have different choices. Certainly with the Palestinians and Hamas, that could also be the case. But the other aspect is, as you look to the next administration, I can't speak to the Harris administration, but we can look to the Trump administration by looking to the past Trump administration. The past Trump administration policy towards Iran was solely focused extensively on preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The Biden administration has not acted as if they've had that urgency. The Biden administration has acted like, well, we have unfailable intelligence, which I do not agree, by the way. Being the chairman of intelligence, I can say I don't believe it's unfailable. And that with this unfailable intelligence, we've got plenty of time, and as having plenty of time, we don't have the same urgency. And so they've waltzed through this administration without addressing this issue of Iran becoming a nuclear state. With the Trump administration, with the pressure campaign, really focused on preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And now coupling that with Israel's efforts to dismantle the proxies, you really could have a significant impact on Iran and Iran's march to becoming a nuclear weapon state. I don't know what the Harris administration would look like. I mean, if they were a continuation of the Biden administration's um, uh, feeling like it's not an emergency or an immediate need, we could lose this opportunity. But there really is an opportunity to impact Iran's march to becoming a nuclear weapon state.
And so in short, how do you think the Trump administration might differ in its approach to the Middle East right now from the Biden administration at the moment?
If you couple the maximum pressure campaign with Israel's success on significantly dismantling the proxies, as you were just acknowledging and noting, you could have a significant impact on Iran.
So
Because they've tried to avoid really the impact directly on Iran by the nefarious actions of their proxies. If the proxies' activity begins to diminish and the focus becomes directly on Iran itself, especially since they've stepped behind the proxies and attacked Israel twice directly, you really put them directly on the table, and that's going to be new for them.
Mr. Chairman, we rarely get so many questions. You really excited our viewership. So I'm going to switch to China now. It all circles around the same thing, how a Trump administration would be different toward China, and what role, and particularly your committee, should play in positioning us. But let me also deal with a couple of other questions that have come in. One of them talking about whether the next president should make clear he would defend Taiwan from an invasion from the PRC. So in other words, abandoning strategic ambiguity. And then I'll hold off on the economic technological question that will come next.
Well, I don't think that the new administration either will or should do that.
Mm-hmm. And in general, how would the Trump administration be different toward China in the Indo-Pacific and in the competition, economic, politically, and militarily?
Well, and I think you gave the right transition, and that is we have got to win again back economically. The way that we diminish our vulnerabilities with China is to reestablish economically our security. And with that, we, of course, diminish theirs. Also on the side of intelligence and our vulnerability for data, our vulnerability to hacking and their access to us, all of those have to be addressed. And I think certainly the next administration, surely the Trump administration will do so. There has to be consequences. Currently, this administration has done nothing to address any of the incursions that we've found by China. In following almost just the precedent set by the Obama administration of stepping forward and saying, we found that China's done this, we found that China's done that, without any consequences to China. If China is penetrating our systems, China needs to have consequences, and those incursions into our systems need to be stopped, and China needs to have consequences for doing so.
These are such tough issues. I probably should have followed up on your answer on strategic ambiguity, so I will. Why would you keep that policy, and maybe you could flesh out a little bit more what the approach to Taiwan ought to be under a Republican president?
Well, I think I'll leave that to a Republican president. I mean, it obviously has a great deal of complexities, and I think there's going to be a lot that a new administration is going to have to deal with, and I think this administration, luckily, has a record and a history on this issue. So it's not like the Harris administration, where not only we're going to have to figure out what is the Harris administration going to do, she's not fully embracing the Biden administration's policy and has been weak on a lot of them. Luckily, the Trump administration not only has a record, but it's one that both our allies and our adversaries will be able to look at the administration and say, well, we at least know where they're going to be.
And then one more on China, de-risking. The de-risking from China in key technology sectors, is that the right approach? Is a more fulsome economic decoupling from China necessary? You talked to a certain degree on the economic questions with China, but how would you address these decoupling, de-risking issues and technology controls?
Well, I mean, we're going to be making some of those steps already in technology, both in chips as we're moving forward in reestablishing domestic production. And I think the fact that the Trump administration, candidate Trump has said on during this turn that he's going to be looking at ways in which we can strengthen our domestic production in a number of ways, including looking at protecting some of those. And I think that's looking at those, how do we find ways to trust our systems? And in part of it is informed by ways in which we've seen that not only has China taken advantage of our vulnerabilities economically, but also in penetrating our systems in both in data and intelligence. And there is great vulnerabilities there and very, very grave concerns.
One more on Ukraine, and then I'll ask a final question, and then I think our time will be up. Short question, hard to answer. How would you define what victory is for Ukraine and the West in this war? From Timothy Ruane, retired Washington Post.
Well, a free and democratic Ukraine. I mean, obviously, Putin has defined it as he owns it and has it. And he has defined it as it's not even a valid country. Whether or not it is a negotiated settlement and that there is some compromise in territory will something that history will have to see. But it has to. We have to make certain that Putin does not have victory. But I will put a caveat on that a lot of people have not yet. We need to make certain that Crimea does not become militarized. Crimea cannot become the new Kaliningrad, or basically through Kaliningrad and Crimea, Putin will be able to have reconstituted the reach of the former Soviet Union through the Warsaw Pact countries by merely owning two pieces of real estate. We'll have to ensure that Crimea does not become its access to be able to have a military threat to Eastern Europe.
And that assumes Ukraine would not get back, get back Crimea. So
Right.
Democratic and
if
free.
there is a concession and they keep
Yeah.
Crimea, it has to be one that is not militarized.
And do you see an agreement that lands Ukraine in NATO, or was that something you would want in the future, where Ukraine is integrated in both NATO and the European Union, or is that just
Well, a
too
free
far?
and democratic Ukraine means that they are free and democratic and able to determine self-determination, right? Which both includes NATO and Ukraine determining that for themselves in the future.
Yeah. So, final question, and you must have been asked this 100 times, but for somebody in your position, chairing an intelligence committee, I just can't help but ask, what keeps you up at night? What
Actually,
of all the things, what of all
yeah.
the dangers we're looking at? What if everything you're looking at really concerns you to that degree?
Yeah, actually, I sleep pretty well at night. It's like while I'm awake that the to-do list, it looks pretty daunting. And I think that the issue on the to-do list really is it's not the things that our adversaries are doing, and it's not the things that we don't know. It's the things that we know that we don't do anything about. That to-do list, the undone to-do list, is the one that I think the ones that troubles me the most. It's the things that we know we should be doing and that we're not. It's the things that I think are 60% issues for both the American public and Congress that still remain undone. Those are the ones that don't always raise to the top, and that they're not going to on social media get a lot of commentary and discussion, but they are the ones we need to get done. And that's why I want to thank you, because you help make certain we advance that discussion and dialogue and debate on all those issues that aren't the ones necessarily that everybody's going to be waving flags at, but are the ones that are on the do list that are the must-dos and that are good for all of us and are good for democracy. And for that, Fred, I want to thank you because you do that every day.
Chair Turner, I want to thank you. We've known each other for many, many years. I've followed your career. I didn't get to give you the full long introduction in the beginning because we got cut off there. But your work as chairman of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, you're now vice chairman of the Defense Security Committee. Over the past 2 decades, you've worked serving your constituents, U.S. citizens, one of our finest public servants. So it's just been an honor and it's been a fascinating discussion. And thanks to all the great questions from the audience. Thank you, Chairman Turner.
Thanks for having me.